So more properties. We're going to talk about the identity property. And for addition, the identity is 0. And so the property says if you take a number, any real number, and you add 0 to it, it's not going to change the number. So that's why it's called the identity. It gives you back what you started to. You're adding 0, but it doesn't change the number. There's also an identity property for multiplication. And so we say A times 1 equals A. And so 1 is the identity for multiplication. We call 1 the multiplicative identity, which is fun to say. Okay. Inverse properties. An inverse property says you can do an operation and you're going to get, it's going to equal the identity. So for addition, if you take any real number and you add its opposite, those will add up to 0. So you take 2 plus -2, you take -5 plus 5, those add up to 0, okay? So that's the inverse property. It says if you take a number, for addition, if you take a number and you add its opposite, you will get the identity for addition, which is 0, okay? We also have an inverse property for multiplication, and it says if you take a number and you multiply it by its reciprocal, that will equal 1. And so in multiplication, the identity is 1. So if you take any real number and you multiply it times its reciprocal, it's going to equal 1. So say you had 2/3 and you multiplied it times 3/2, you would get 1. Because the 2's would cancel, the 3's would cancel, or you could multiply it out and get 6/6, but it's going to equal 1. Okay, so now we have to talk about the properties of 0. Well, we talked about it in addition, but in multiplication. So if you take any real number and you multiply it times 0, that's going to equal 0. So that's always fun to do with children when they're first learning their multiplication tables and you go times 0, well, 0. Okay. Division. Well, if you have 0 and you divide it by a real number, that's going to equal 0. That follows the rule that says we check division by multiplication. And so if you took that divisor, A, times 0, you would get 0. So that is true. But if you have any real number and you try to divide it by 0, that is undefined. Okay? Or sometimes they'll say it does not exist. So we can't divide by 0. That's not allowed. You don't get a real number. So just remember, can't divide by 0. Okay, that's undefined. Okay, so our next example here, we have a negative, on this example 3, we have a negative 27a, but over here we have a positive 27a. So because of our properties that we did earlier with commutative and associative properties, we can put those two together. And because those are, let me write it, negative 27a plus 27a, and then we still have the negative 48a. That's okay. But these two make 0, right? Because they're opposites of each other. So now you have 0 plus negative 48a. And 0 plus anything is just that thing. So our answer is going to be negative 48a. Okay. So similar over here on example 4, we have 9/16 times 16/9. If I use the commutative and associative properties, kind of rearrange the order. And then I have 5/49. And then the 9 cancels and the 16 cancels, and you just get 1. But 1 times whatever is going to be whatever. So the answer here is going to be 5/49. So sometimes when we see those inverse properties and we apply them, it makes the problem easier to do. Okay, so we want to go over this last one, and they have a little bit of extra notation here, so I wanted to talk about that a little bit. It says for part A, 0/m plus 7. But there's this little clause afterward that says, and by the way, m cannot equal -7. So we know from the property that 0 divided by m plus 7, 0 divided by whatever real number is going to be 0. That is true. but we have to make a stipulation that m cannot be -7, because if m were -7, then we would have 0 over 0. And that's an indeterminate form. We're not allowed to divide by 0 still. And you'll talk about that when you take calculus. But they have to put that clause in there to say, hey, this works for all real numbers except m can't be -7, because then we'd be dividing by 0 and that would cause us problems. Okay, similarly, a little bit different, 18 minus 6c over 0. Well, this is going to be undefined. But again, they put in that clause that the numerator can't be 0 because you'd have 0 over 0, and that's what you're going to talk about when you take calculus. So, okay.